freeze. Right there. Don't move past this moment. The lights are blazing. The cameras are rolling. Thousands of believers have packed into this venue. Dressed up, fired up, ready to be inspired. It's the kind of Christian event that fills arenas and trends on social media before the opening prayer is even finished. The air is electric with expectation. And standing at the center of it all are two names that every person in that room knows. Joyce Meyer, one of the most powerful Christian communicators on the planet. Decades of ministry, a global empire of influence built on bold preaching, best-selling books, and an unshakable confidence that she knows exactly what God wants and exactly how to say it. And Jonathan Roumie, the soft-spoken Lebanese-American actor who became a cultural phenomenon almost entirely by accident, or, as he would say, entirely by grace. The man who put on the robes, looked into the camera, and portrayed Jesus of Nazareth in a way that broke people open and brought millions back to faith. Two giants of the modern Christian world. In the same room, on the same stage. And then something happened that nobody saw coming. What Joyce Meyer said to Jonathan Roumie, in front of thousands of believers, shocked even the most seasoned voices in the Christian world. The room changed in an instant. You could feel it. The way a summer afternoon changes right before a storm rolls in. Shoulders stiffened in the front rows, eyes cut sideways. A murmur moved through the crowd like a current, low and uneasy. The sound of thousands of people suddenly unsure whether what they were witnessing was real. Because this wasn't a scripted disagreement. This wasn't a theatrical debate set up for engagement. This was a collision, raw, unplanned, and undeniable, between two fundamentally different visions of what Christianity is supposed to look like in the modern world. On one side, the polished machinery of prosperity gospel celebrity culture, built on brand, authority, and the assumption that seniority earns the right to define who belongs. On the other, a man who had spent years in obscurity, who never sought a platform, and whose entire witness was built on one thing, pointing away from himself. The room held its breath. And Joyce Meyer leaned into the microphone. But what Roumie did next? Nobody in that room, or watching at home, saw it coming. To understand why this moment detonated the way it did, you have to understand the world it happened in. American Christianity in 2024 is not a unified movement. It hasn't been for a long time. What was once a shared cultural identity has fractured into a landscape of competing visions, competing platforms, and competing definitions of what it even means to follow Jesus. On one end of the spectrum, you have the machine, the stadium tours, the merchandise tables, the green rooms and brand deals and social media teams, managing the image of faith like a Fortune 500 company manages its quarterly earnings, churches that seat thousands, pastors who fly private, ministries with budgets that rival mid-sized corporations, and audiences that rival pop stars. And on the other end, quieter, less polished, but impossible to ignore. Something else has been building. A hunger. A grassroots movement of believers who are exhausted by the performance of Christianity and desperate for something that feels like the real thing. People who grew up in the pews and drifted away, not because they stopped believing, but because they stopped recognizing what they believed in on the stage in front of them. That's the fault line. And this event sat right on top of it. The venue that day was not a small gathering. This was a flagship moment in the Christian calendar, the kind of event that draws ministry leaders, worship artists, theologians, influencers, and everyday believers from across the country. Cameras from multiple platforms were set up to stream the proceedings to hundreds of thousands watching online. The audience inside was a cross-section of modern American faith, young and old, Catholic and evangelical, lifelong churchgoers, and people still finding their way back. They came because the names on the program carried weight. They came expecting inspiration. What they got was a reckoning, because even before the confrontation peaked, something was buzzing. Social media had already picked up on the energy in the room. Clips were being posted, comments were flying, people who weren't even there were watching the live stream and typing in real time. The faith world, which had been simmering with unspoken tensions for years, could feel that something was about to break open. And everyone, whether they admitted it or not, was leaning forward. The question underneath all of it was one that nobody had quite been willing to ask out loud. Who speaks for Christianity today? Who has earned the right to stand on that stage and represent the faith of billions? Is it the woman with the 50-year ministry, the global reach, the theological confidence that fills arenas? Or is it the man with the quiet eyes and the borrowed robes, who never asked for a platform, but somehow became the face that millions associated with the living Christ. It is a question about power, about authenticity, about whether the church belongs to the institution or to the broken people the institution was built to serve. What was about to unfold would split faith communities down the middle and force every viewer to ask where they truly stood. This was not just two people disagreeing on a stage. This was a mirror held up to the entire modern church, and nobody in that room was going to escape what they saw in it. But to understand why this confrontation hit so hard, you need to know who these two people really are. And the worlds they come from couldn't be more different. Joyce Meyer did not arrive at power easily. That part is important. That part is true. And if you're going to understand what happened on that stage, you have to start there, with the woman before the brand, before the empire, before the private jets and the television programs, and the ministry headquarters that looks more like a corporate campus than a church. Joyce Meyer grew up in a home that should have broken her permanently. The abuse she suffered at the hands of her father began in childhood and lasted for years. A darkness so profound that most people who live through it never fully find their way out. She has spoken about it publicly, written about it honestly, and built an entire theology around the idea that God can redeem what the world has destroyed. That testimony is real. The pain that produced it was real. And for millions of women around the world who found her voice during the lowest moments of their lives, that reality matters enormously and should not be dismissed. She started preaching in the 1970s, teaching small Bible studies in St. Louis, when nobody was paying attention and nobody was offering her a platform. She was turned away, talked over, and dismissed by churches, by male leaders, by a religious establishment that did not believe a woman had any business standing behind a pulpit. She pushed anyway. She built anyway, and slowly, painfully, she carved out a space in a world that had told her repeatedly she didn't belong in it. That persistence is the foundation of everything Joyce Meyer became. You cannot take it away from her. You should not try. But here is where the story turns, because somewhere along the road from those early Bible studies to the global ministry empire, Joyce Meyer Ministries became something shifted. The woman who once preached from a place of nothing, from trauma, from rejection, from the kind of scarcity that makes every small blessing feel like a miracle, began to accumulate in ways that made the faithful uncomfortable and the critics loud. The reports started surfacing in the early 2000s. A $2 million home, multiple additional properties purchased with ministry funds, a private jet, a $23,000 antique commode in the ministry's office building. The figures were reported, disputed, and reported again. Meyer defended the spending, arguing that a minister of her reach required infrastructure commensurate with her mission. Her supporters agreed. Her critics, including mainstream evangelical voices and Catholic theologians who had previously respected her work, did not. The prosperity gospel shadow fell long over her ministry. The theology that equates faith with financial blessing, spiritual health with material success, and God's favor with visible abundance became more and more embedded in her public messaging. And, for a church already struggling to explain itself to a skeptical world, that association carried a cost. The contrast was not lost on anyone watching closely. The woman who had survived poverty, Lise, was now preaching to people still living in it from a stage that cost more than most of her audience would earn in a lifetime. The woman who had been dismissed and talked over had become, by sheer force of will and decades of relentless work, one of the most powerful voices in global Christianity. And power, even when it is earned through suffering, has a way of changing the way a person moves through a room. Joyce Meyer moves like someone who knows her name, like someone who has spent 50 years fighting for a seat at the table and is not about to apologize for sitting in it. That confidence is magnetic. It has drawn millions to her message and kept them there. But it also carries an edge, a directness, a bluntness, a willingness to say the hard thing out loud without softening it. That does not always land as she intends. Those who know her ministry well will tell you that this is simply her style, that she calls it as she sees it, that she has never been interested in performing diplomacy when she believes the truth is more useful. And that is precisely what made what happened on that stage so significant. Because when Joyce Meyer looked across at Jonathan Roumie that day, she was not looking at an equal. Not in her framing. She was a 50-year veteran of Christian ministry, addressing someone the faith world had only recently discovered, a relative newcomer to the arena she had bled to build. The posture, the tone, The weight of her words all carried the unmistakable implication. I have been here longer. I know better. Let me show you how this works. It was her greatest strength, walking directly into its greatest miscalculation. But the man she chose to confront that day had a story that no amount of fame or platform could diminish, and she was about to find that out before the robes, before the millions of viewers, before the viral clips and the standing ovations and the testimonials from strangers who said watching him changed their lives. There was just a guy in Los Angeles, auditioning for things he didn't get, waiting for something he couldn't name, and quietly wondering whether any of it was ever going to amount to anything. Jonathan Roumie was not discovered. He was not groomed for greatness by a network or a ministry or a powerful mentor who saw something special and fast-tracked him to the front of the line. He is Lebanese-American, Catholic, the son of an immigrant father who carried his own story of displacement and reinvention to a new country and built something from it. That inheritance, the particular texture of a life shaped by people who know what it costs to start over, runs through everything Jonathan Roumie is. His acting career before The Chosen was the kind that doesn't make highlight reels, small parts, background roles, guest appearances on television shows you watched without registering his face. The grind that most performers quietly endure for years, before either breaking through or walking away. The cycle of auditions and rejections and callbacks that don't lead anywhere, and the slow, wearing question that every artist eventually has to answer. Is this worth it? Is this who I am supposed to be? He almost said no. By his own account, there were moments when the door felt permanently closed, when the gap between the work he was putting in and the life he had imagined felt too wide to keep crossing every morning. He prayed. He waited. He kept going, not with the electric certainty of someone who had received a vision, but with the quiet stubbornness of someone who simply could not find a good enough reason to stop. And then came The Chosen. When Dallas Jenkins was casting the role of Jesus for his independently produced series on the life of Christ, the process was, by Hollywood standards, unremarkable. Auditions, callbacks, the standard machinery of finding the right person for the right part. But what happened when Roumie walked in was something that everyone present seemed to struggle to describe in purely professional terms. It wasn't just that he looked the part or hit the right notes in the audition. It was something harder to articulate. A quality of presence, of stillness, of genuine interior life that read on camera as something close to sacred. Roumie himself has never described getting the role as a career win. He describes it as a calling he was afraid of. He has spoken publicly about the weight he felt when he understood what he was being asked to carry, that portraying Jesus was not a performance challenge, but a spiritual responsibility, one that required him to be something more than a skilled actor hitting his marks. He prayed before every scene. He fasted. He sought confession. He approached the role not as a man embodying a character, but as a man trying imperfectly and humbly to be a worthy vessel for something infinitely larger than himself. Back his tears, that posture defined everything about how The Chosen landed, because audiences are not naive. They can feel the difference between a performance and a witness. And what millions of viewers encountered when they watched Jonathan Roumie as Jesus was not a polished Hollywood portrayal of a historical figure. It was something that felt, inexplicably, undeniably, like an encounter. Testimonials flooded in from people who had never stepped inside a church, from addicts in recovery, from people who had grown up in faith and drifted away and thought the door was closed forever, from people who were not sure they believed in anything and found themselves weeping at a streaming series in a way they couldn't explain to anyone. And through all of it, the cultural phenomenon, the sold-out live events, the meetings with bishops and cardinals and faith leaders around the world, the audiences with Pope Francis, Roumie kept doing the same thing. He pointed away from himself, every interview, every platform, every moment when the world offered him the pedestal that fame builds automatically, he stepped off it. He talked about the people the show had reached. He talked about God. He deflected the praise with a consistency that did not feel rehearsed or strategic, but simply true. The natural reflex of a man who genuinely did not believe the credit belonged to him. This is what made him different. Not his talent, though the talent is real. Not his story, though the story is compelling. Not what made Jonathan Roumie an almost singular figure in modern faith culture was the complete absence of empire in him. He had no institution to protect, no theological brand to defend, no infrastructure that required him to win arguments or establish dominance or remind anyone in the room of how long he had been doing this. He was, simply and completely, a man who had said yes to something bigger than himself, and had spent every day since trying to stay small enough to keep carrying it. And it was precisely that humility, that refusal to play the celebrity Christian game, that made what was about to happen in that room feel like watching someone bring a sword to a prayer meeting. Because when Joyce Meyer stepped toward the microphone with that look on her face, the room knew something was coming. They just didn't know it would end like this. The moment didn't announce itself. That's the thing about the moments that change everything. They rarely do. 1 second the program was moving along the way. These events always move, with the rhythm of practiced speakers and rehearsed transitions, and the comfortable predictability of a stage managed by professionals. And then Joyce Meyer leaned forward, and the temperature in the room dropped 3 degrees, and everyone felt it simultaneously without being able to explain why. Her body language changed first. The relaxed authority she carried naturally, the posture of a woman who had owned stages for 5 decades, sharpened into something more directed, more pointed. She turned toward Roumie with a particular focus of someone who has decided that now is the moment to say the thing they came to say, and she said it. The specific words have been described differently by different people in that room, but the substance, the unmistakable, undeniable substance, was a challenge, a public one, delivered without apology and without softening. Some, who were present, said she questioned the theological grounding behind the chosen's portrayal of Christ, suggesting that popularity was not the same as doctrinal accuracy. Others recalled her implying that Roumie's Catholic faith placed him at an inherent remove from the evangelical tradition that had built the very audience his show depended on. Still others described it more simply, as a veteran of the faith world reminding a newcomer, in front of thousands of people, that a hit television series did not constitute a ministry credential. However the exact words landed, the meaning was clear to everyone in that room. You don't belong at this table. Not really. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The audience response was immediate and physical. You could see it ripple outward from the front rows, like something dropped into still water. Heads turned. Shoulders pulled inward. The comfortable expectation of an inspiring evening curdled into the uneasy electricity of witnessing something that was not supposed to happen in a place like this. People glanced at the person next to them. The silent language of shared discomfort. The collective need to confirm that yes, you heard that too, that was real, that just happened. And then everyone looked at Jonathan Roumie. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply waited. No color rose in his face. No tension entered his jaw. His hands, visible and still, did not move. He sat with the challenge hanging in the air between them like smoke. And he did not reach for it, and he did not back away from it. And the composure he held in that moment was so complete and so quiet that it became, in itself, a kind of answer. It was the wrong signal for Joyce Meyer to read as weakness. She pressed forward. Her voice carried the full weight of her history now, 50 years of ministry, thousands of sermons, millions of lives touched, a resume that she had earned through suffering and built through relentless, undeniable work. She invoked it, not subtly. She reminded the room, and Roumie, of the distance between someone who had spent decades in the trenches of real ministry and someone who had, however movingly, played a role in a television series. The implication crystallized with every additional sentence. I have earned this floor. You have not. In the audience, something shifted again, but differently this time. The discomfort was curdling into something else, into protectiveness, into the particular anger that rises in people when they watch someone being diminished publicly and unfairly, and the target of that diminishment refuses to defend themselves in the way the aggressor expects. People were leaning forward now. Not away, because Roumie still hadn't moved, still hadn't risen to meet her on her terms, still hadn't done what every instinct in that room expected him to do. He sat in the silence she had created around him, like a man who had been in a room like this before, like a man who knew something about this moment that nobody else in the building had figured out yet. The audience held its breath. Joyce Meyer finished her point and waited for the reaction she was accustomed to receiving. She didn't get it, and then, in a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and shared millions of times, Jonathan Roumie opened his mouth, and everything changed. He took a breath, not a sharp one, not the kind that signals anger gathering itself for release. A slow breath, deliberate and unhurried, the breath of a man who has learned through years of obscurity and prayer, and the particular discipline of playing someone who never once rushed, that silence is not empty, that it has weight, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of noise is simply refuse to add to it. The audience waited, and Jonathan Roumie began to speak. He started with her, not with a rebuttal, not with a defense. He turned toward Joyce Meyer, with something in his expression that the room took a moment to identify because it was the last thing anyone expected to see on the face of a man who had just been publicly challenged in front of thousands of people. It was gratitude. He acknowledged her, genuinely, specifically, without performance. He spoke about what her ministry had meant to women who had survived the unsurvivable, women who had found her voice in the wreckage of their lives and held on to it like a rope. He named the real thing she had built. He honored the suffering that had produced it. And he did it with such evident sincerity that the audience, which had been coiled tight with anticipatory tension, slowly began to exhale. And then the room got confused, because it started to look like he was going to let it go, like he was going to absorb the challenge, offer the gracious acknowledgement, and redirect the conversation back to safer ground. That is what the room expected. That is what the room, in its discomfort, almost hoped for. But that is not what happened. Because after the acknowledgement came the pivot, and it arrived so quietly, so precisely, that the room almost missed the moment it changed. He said he wanted to talk about letters, not about theology, not about denominational credentials or doctrinal frameworks, or the question of who had earned the right to stand on which stage. Letters, the ones that arrived in his inbox and his team's inbox in volumes that none of them had been prepared for when the chosen first reached the world. He described them without drama, without the practiced emotional inflation of someone working an audience. He simply told the truth about what he had read. A man in a prison cell in Ohio, who had watched the series on a contraband phone and written to say that for the first time in 11 years, he had felt something he recognized as hope. A teenage girl in rural Tennessee who had been 3 days away from ending her life when her mother put the show on the television, and she watched Jesus look at a broken woman with eyes that held no judgment whatsoever, and decided to stay. A father in Ireland who had left the church 30 years ago in bitterness and grief, and had watched the first episode on a Saturday night expecting nothing, and had called his priest the next morning. He didn't take credit for any of it. Every letter, every story, every testimony, he held it up and then set it down in the same direction. Not toward himself, not toward the show, toward the only source he believed any of it came from. He said quietly that he was not under any illusion about what he was, that he was an actor from Chicago who had struggled to pay his rent for most of his adult life, and who had been handed something he did not deserve and could not explain, and had spent every day since trying to be careful with it. And then, still without raising his voice, still without a single gesture toward confrontation, he addressed the challenge directly. He said that in every one of those letters, in every one of those stories, he had noticed something. That the people who had been reached were not reached because of correct doctrine. They were not reached because someone had verified his theological credentials or approved his denominational affiliation or confirmed that he had spent enough years in ministry to be trusted with the message. They were reached because something had gotten through. Something had found the crack in the wall that pain and time and disappointment had built around their hearts, and had gotten through. He paused. And then he said that he did not believe it was the job of anyone who claimed to follow Jesus to make that wall thicker. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. You could feel the room processing it, the way a congregation processes a sermon that has just landed somewhere private and true. A woman in the third row pressed her hand to her mouth. A man near the back closed his eyes. The soft sound of people quietly coming apart at the seams began to move through the audience like a tide coming in. He spoke then about his faith, his specific, particular Catholic faith, not as a position to defend, but as a home he was grateful to have. He said that Christ did not belong to any denomination, that the love he had tried, imperfectly and prayerfully, to put on screen was not Catholic love or evangelical love or Protestant love. It was the love that had walked into rooms full of people who had been told they were too broken, too sinful, too far gone, and had said without hesitation, "You are exactly who I came for." The applause began before he finished the sentence. Soft at first, then building. Then the kind of sustained, rising sound that an arena makes when Something true has just been said out loud, in a room full of people who needed to hear it. Joyce Meyer's expression, visible to the cameras that had been trained on the stage throughout, was not the expression of a woman who had won the exchange she had initiated. It was something quieter than that. Something that looked, to the people watching closely, like the particular stillness of someone in the process of being reminded of something they had always known. And then Roumie said the line. Sybil, unadorned, delivered not to the audience, but almost to himself, like a man finishing deing a thought he had been working on for a long time. I'm not here to represent Christianity. I'm here to represent the one who said nobody was too lost to be found. The room erupted, and within hours, so did the rest of the world. The event hadn't even ended. That's the detail that tells you everything about the velocity of what was unleashed in that room. Before the closing prayer. Before the final speaker left the stage. Before the house lights came up and the crowd began moving toward the exits. The clips were already out. Phones had been recording from the moment the room sensed something was shifting. And by the time Roumie finished that last line, dozens of separate recordings of the same moment were already uploading simultaneously to every platform that exists. The internet did not wait for context. It never does. But this time the context was already in the clip. You didn't need a thread explaining what had happened. You didn't need a commentator to tell you which side to stand on. You watched it and you felt it, in the same unmediated, unambiguous way that the audience inside that room had felt it. And then you sent it to the first person you thought of. Within 2 hours. The clip was everywhere. On X, it moved the way only a handful of things move. Not pushed by algorithm alone, but pulled by human hands. Shared person to person by people who felt compelled to make sure someone else saw it. Faith accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers posted it without commentary, just the video and a single line underneath. Watch this. Catholic pages shared it alongside evangelical pages in a display of cross-denominational unanimity that almost never happens in the fractured landscape of Christian social media. The hashtags formed organically, not manufactured by a PR team, but assembled spontaneously by thousands of people reaching for the same words at the same time. On TikTok, the clip was cut into a dozen different formats within hours, with text overlays, with reaction videos stitched alongside it. With the final line, I'm not here to represent Christianity. I'm here to represent the one who said nobody was too lost to be found. Isolated and placed over images of sunrise and candlelight and empty churches and crowded ones. Young creators who had never discussed faith publicly on their platforms posted it with captions about being unexpectedly moved. Comment sections that normally run toward cynicism filled, instead with people typing out things they had never said publicly before. This is why I still believe. I needed this today. I don't even go to church and I'm crying. On YouTube, the longer cuts spread through the faith commentary ecosystem with extraordinary speed. Channels that had spent years documenting the tensions inside modern Christianity, the prosperity gospel debates, the celebrity pastor scandals, the slow institutional erosion of trust, recognized immediately what they were looking at. This was not just a viral moment. This was a document. A before and after marker in the ongoing argument about what Christianity was supposed to be and who was supposed to speak for it. The commentators came quickly, and they came in force. Faith podcasters dedicated full episodes to unpacking the exchange within 24 hours. Theologians who rarely agreed on anything found themselves in unusual alignment. Christian journalists at publications across the denominational spectrum wrote pieces that all arrived at variations of the same conclusion, that what Roumie had demonstrated on that stage was not just admirable but instructive, that his response was a model for something the church had been struggling to articulate for years. How to hold conviction without weaponizing it. How to absorb a public challenge without either collapsing or retaliating. How to make the message larger by making yourself smaller. Some went further. Several prominent voices in the evangelical world, figures who had publicly wrestled with the excesses of celebrity Christianity and the damage done by platforms that prioritized influence over integrity, called it a defining moment, not just for Roumie. For the witness of the faith itself, Joyce Meyer's ministry, meanwhile, was quiet in a way that was itself conspicuous. No statement, no response video, no social media acknowledgement of the moment that was dominating every conversation in the world, her ministry inhabited. For a platform built entirely on voice, on the conviction that she had something to say, and the world needed to hear it. The silence landed differently than silence usually does. People noticed. They noted it without cruelty, mostly, but they noted it. And then there was The Chosen. The show's streaming numbers spiked within 48 hours in a way that the production team described as unlike anything they had seen outside of a major season launch. New viewers arrived in waves, people who had heard the name but never watched, people who had been meaning to get to it, people who saw the clip and needed to understand who this man was before he became this man. Donation links to the show's crowdfunding infrastructure, which had sustained its independent production model from the beginning, saw a surge that the team publicly acknowledged with visible astonishment and gratitude. And the testimonial started again. New ones. Thousands of them. People writing in to say that the clip had brought them back to something they thought they had left behind for good. But beyond the viral moment, beyond the hashtags and the hot takes, something deeper had happened in that room. And the question it left behind was one the entire Christian world was now being forced to answer. Let it settle for a moment. Because what just happened deserves more than a hot take. It deserves more than a hashtag and a share, and the dopamine hit of watching the right person win a public argument. What happened in that room was something rarer than viral, something that doesn't come along often in the noise and performance of modern public life, and certainly not in the highly managed, carefully branded world of Christian media. What happened was true. And truth, when it finally arrives in a room that has been waiting for it, even a room that didn't know it was waiting, doesn't just inform. It reorganizes. It moves through the people who witness it and leaves them slightly different than they were before. That's what you could see on the faces of that audience as Roumie finished speaking. Not just the relief of watching a good person hold their ground, something deeper. The particular stillness of people who have just been reminded of something they had let themselves forget. So let's name what this confrontation actually was. It was a parable, as precise and purposeful as any parable told on a hillside 2,000 years ago. Though this one was told under arena lighting with cameras rolling and thousands of phones recording. It was the story of what happens when an institution built on platform, on influence, on the accumulated authority of decades, walks directly into the one force it was never designed to overcome. Genuine humility, not performed humility. Not the strategic self-deprecation of someone who has learned that appearing modest is good for the brand. The real thing. The kind that has no mechanism for ego protection because the ego was never the point. The kind that can sit inside a public challenge, absorb the full weight of it, and respond not from the place that was wounded, but from the place that was called. What Roumie revealed in that response was something the church, and honestly, the world, is desperately hungry to see demonstrated rather than preached. That composure under fire is not passivity. That refusing to fight on an attacker's terms is not surrender. That the most devastating thing you can do to an argument built on pride is meet it with something pride has no answer for. He didn't out-argue Joyce Meyer. He rendered the argument irrelevant, and that is an altogether different and more powerful thing. And here is where fairness requires us to look at Meyer not as a villain but as a mirror. Because her mistake, the one that cost her the room and the moment and the days of silence that followed, was not a unique one. It was not the mistake of a uniquely corrupt or arrogant person. It was the mistake that power makes with tragic regularity in every field, in every institution, in every tradition that begins in sacrifice and ends in infrastructure. The mistake of confusing the legacy you have built with the truth you are trying to serve. The mistake of letting the decades you have invested become a credential that entitles you to judge those who arrive by a different road. She is not the first. She will not be the last. And every single one of us, if we are honest, has a version of that same mechanism running somewhere inside us. The voice that says, I have been here longer, I have paid more, I know better, and therefore I have the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. Roumie's response was a rebuke to that voice, not delivered in anger, delivered in love, which is the only kind of rebuke that actually changes anything. And now lift it higher. Because this was never only a Christian story. This is the story of what happens in every room where power confronts authenticity and discovers that authenticity will not negotiate with it. It is the story of every institution that mistakes seniority for wisdom. Every tradition that mistakes the container for the water it was built to carry. Every person who has ever been told they don't belong at a table and responded not by demanding a seat but by quietly expanding the room. Roumie himself would resist every word of this framing. He has said consistently, in every interview, in every public moment where praise is directed at him, that he is nobody's savior, that the role he plays is only powerful because of who it points toward, that the moment the audience starts looking at the finger, instead of following where it points, something essential has already been lost. That is the message. That has always been the message. And that night, in that room, the world didn't just watch a confrontation. It watched a man choose, in real time, to be what he played on screen. And that, more than any sermon, any platform, any empire, is what the church looks like when it's working. You just watched something rare. A moment when someone had every right to fight back, and chose grace instead. A moment when the most powerful response available was the one that looked, from the outside, like no response at all. And it moved the world more than any argument ever could. More than any rebuttal, any clap back, any perfectly constructed takedown designed to win the room and trend by morning, because here is the truth that this entire story has been building toward. The confrontation that was supposed to go wrong did. Just not for the person everyone expected. You cannot confront someone who has nothing to defend. You cannot rattle someone whose identity is not located in their reputation. You cannot diminish someone who was never trying to be large in the first place. Joyce Meyer walked into that exchange carrying every weapon that public life offers: seniority, platform, doctrinal authority, decades of earned credibility, and every single one of those weapons dissolved on contact with the one thing they were never built to overcome: a servant who actually believed it: faith, humility, dignity, servant leadership. The world will tell you these are soft virtues, admirable in theory, impractical in the arena where real power moves. The world is wrong. They are not weaknesses. They are the most disruptive forces on earth. They have been toppling empires and outlasting institutions since the first century. They are still doing it now. On live stream stages, in front of thousands. In clips that travel the world before the house lights come up. Carry something from this video. Not just the story, the posture. The reminder that the next time something comes at you sideways, in public, in a way that feels designed to diminish you, you have a choice. You can fight on their terms, or you can choose the response that the room never sees coming. The room thought it was watching a confrontation. It was actually watching a sermon. Hit subscribe, because we're just getting started.